Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for the third Peabody Research Spotlight. My name is Janet Martinez, and I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Graduate Education at Peabody. And I am so delighted that you took the time to hear from alumni across all 5 departments at Peabody, so you can get a taste of the research that they are engaged in and perhaps future directions that they hope to move their research in. And this is really an opportunity to, one, showcase the research, but also ideally to encourage cross-disciplinary collaboration across all of the departments for our current students and really for prospective students to get a sense of what we do at Peabody. So without further ado, the presenters for today are listed here. They will each introduce themselves briefly. And I do want to underscore that it would be really fantastic if you could please mute your microphones so that we don't pick up background noise. And because the sessions are intended to be really short and sweet, the presentations are only going to be about 5 to 7 minutes long. And this will be followed immediately by a Q&A after each presenter. So I would ask that you please use the chat function to type in any comments and specifically questions that you may have for the presenter. And my doctoral student, Min Oh, has graciously agreed to monitor the chat box, and she will go ahead and ask the presenter a couple of questions within that 2 to 3 minute window following their presentations. So thank you again for joining us, and we're going to get started right away. And our first presenter for today is Dr. Devin Kearns, who is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Connecticut. Welcome, Dr. Kearns.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. It's great to see everyone. Got to scroll through the list and see many familiar faces. And I want to start by thanking some of those folks. I see Doug Fuchs is here. And Doug, I want to just acknowledge how grateful I am for all of the support you provided while I was there, and to many other folks who are still there and others who have since moved on. And I'm really grateful to been at Peabody for 5 years, I think, even though when I first arrived, being from New England, called it Peabody in honor of the town in Massachusetts. I've since obviously learned. So next slide. So my work so far has focused on polysyllabic words, and polysyllabic words are the same as multisyllabic words. I just had a paper one time where I said that, and now I'm stuck with it. But these words are important. And you can see here from a couple of papers that I've written that the number of polysyllabic words really increases over the grades. Did a recent study of curricula for 2 grades, grades 1 through 3, across 3 different reading programs. And my colleague, Elfrida Hebert, and I found that the number of syllables in the words by grade increases. You can see there the 1-syllable words decrease in frequency as the other syllables increase. So we know that these words are important. Next slide. And because these words have some complications about their vowels, it makes it very hard to decode them. So if you look at the words on the left side, they all contain the letter I, but in each one, the letter I makes a different sound. In minor, it says I, in linen, it says I, in glorious, it says E, and rabbit, it says kind of an sound. And the challenge is it's very hard for readers to figure out what to say. In another study I recently published on this topic, I explored whether or not rules that people think exist, in fact, actually work. And there are 2 primary rules I won't describe to you, but I can tell you that one of them works 70% of the time, and the other one works 31% of the time. And so what that tells us is, despite educators' attempts to figure out how to read these words, it's really challenging to do it, and it sort of defies simple explanation. And so my work, as a result, is focused on how can we help students decode these words, even when there aren't easy patterns. Next slide. So one way we've done that is to explore something called mispronunciation correction, and to explore the idea that students actually use spoken knowledge of words when they're reading. And one way that we've done this is to do a test where we ask students to listen to pronunciations by Peter the Lion on the left side, very cute, Peter the Lion. And Peter mispronounces words by saying something like meistery. And the task for children is to say the correct word, which is mystery. And children who are good readers are able to make these corrections really easily. And one theory that I proposed and others have proposed as well is that the reason it's easy for readers to make these adjustments is that they're checking these words against their lexicon. They're engaging in lexical verification, which is to say that they very quickly examine in their head whether or not they have a word that matches, a spoken word that matches what they said. And so there's a form of meaning being used to read those words. And that's caused me to look into ways that we can use that information strategically in intervention. Next slide. So one other way that meaning might be used is looking at parts inside of words. Many words in English contain 2 or more morphemes. Morphemes are meaning parts in words, for example, the photo and synthesis and photosynthesis, polynomial, and so on. And many words across disciplines, you can see there from art to math, have words with more than two or more morphemes. And as a result, it might be useful to exploit this information to help students. And one reason to think that that's a good idea is that there is a lot of information produced by many of my colleagues, but also by myself, suggesting that kids' ability to read those polysyllabic words is strongly dependent on their ability to read polymorphemic words, and their skill in using morphemes is strongly associated with their word recognition skill, and also ultimately their reading comprehension. And I'll acknowledge here too Amanda Goodwin, who is a professor in teaching, learning, and culture, and she has done work with me. I've been fortunate to work with her on this topic. So we know that knowledge of morphemes matters for reading. Next slide. So as a result, we've worked on designing interventions to integrate these 2 components, whether we can include this mispronunciation correction that we saw with Peter the Lion, and whether we can teach children about morphemes to improve their reading outcomes. Next slide. So my current work involves actually doing that. We're currently designing interventions, doing this with collaboration with my colleague Fumiko Haft and my colleague Jay Rickel at UConn. And we have been pilot testing some novel approaches to intervention using some of the elements I just described to you with mispronunciation correction and morpheme use. And we've already pilot tested some of this, and we're currently designing a full-blown intervention we will use this summer, if in fact we can run an intervention in the summer on campus. And one thing that we're doing there, which I won't describe in detail, is using neurobiological outcomes to explore whether or not we can detect effects in the brain, even if we can't see them in academic tests. So that is the work that I'm currently doing.
Thank you so much, Devin. So we're going to go ahead, and you were really good with your time. So we're going to go ahead and open it up for any comments or questions from the audience. And if you can use the chat box, that would be terrific, but you can also feel free to ask the question yourself.
Yep, so we have a first question for Dr. Kearns. How do you see your research on meaning parts apply to children with dyslexia? Have you found any promising evidence with this student population?
And that's really a great question. And the whole idea of this work is to explore the needs of kids with dyslexia. Data indicate that students with dyslexia who respond well to interventions designed for shorter words still struggle when they get to reading the longer words. And I've done some research on that, suggesting that it's strongly correlated with their morphological knowledge. So we believe that this can have really positive effects for children with dyslexia.
Thank you. There is one more question. Do you see a disproportionality with students who are not exposed to as much spoken language in the home as others?
Yeah, that's a great question. I work mostly with upper elementary grade students, and I haven't explored that component of it in my own work, but there are extensive data suggesting that students who come to school with more language exposure are more likely to make good progress in reading. Part of the reason for that is when we think about that lexical verification component, they have more words in their spoken lexicon, they have been exposed to more spoken words, it's easier for them to do that lexical verification. So certainly that's important. It's not something that I've explored in my work with older kids, but whoever said that hit the nail on the head, that preschool knowledge is really critical.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. We know that you have to log off to join another presentation that you're giving. So thank you again for taking the time to do this, Devin. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was nice to see some familiar faces.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're going to move now to our next presenter, who is Dominique Baker, and she is at Southern Methodist University. So Dr. Baker will introduce herself momentarily, and she is a graduate of the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organization.
Hi, everyone. So thank you all so much for having me. I will say right off the top, I just finished a different talk that I was giving on policy research, and occasionally my internet was going in and out. So I apologize in advance. I'm getting the fun connection unstable piece from Zoom, which I hate and love. So I am Dominique Baker. I am when did I graduate? Wow, old. I finished my PhD in 2016 from the Leadership Policy and Organizations Department in higher education with a concentration. So broadly, I study higher education policy. So that's colleges, universities, community colleges, sort of everything that's happening after high school is all in the domain of interest for me. And one of the things that's really big about this that I think is that because I study policy, I really study all of the facets that interact with this. A great example, sometimes people think like, well, does policy really engage with everything? And I just say, oh, please just pay attention to like the great state of Texas where I currently live, where 2 to 3 weeks ago, because of failures in public policy, several of us were without power and water for days. Unfortunately, people died. There are all sorts of very real consequences that happen from public policy. And so it always is a real interest of mine to talk to people about all the ways that policy can play a role in sort of just the living of life, as it were. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So broadly speaking, I focus on the way that education policy affects the access and success of minoritized students in higher education. And I sort of do this in 3 broad bucket areas. Next slide. Which are campus climate and equity, student financial aid, and admissions policies. So let's start with just campus climate and equity. So you can come back to beautiful. There we go. So my job is to try within 7 minutes or less to talk to you about the broad array of work that I do within higher education and policy. So I've tried to just pick a couple of things that I do to give you a feel. So campus climate and equity. The work that I do can broadly range from things like I have run experiments across colleges and universities where I look at an intervention that's psychology based on something called stereotype threat, which is where potentially there are pieces about your identity that are associated with stereotypes. And when you are primed to think about those stereotypes in your identity, you may perform worse on an assignment or a test. And so there's this one way that folks have studied to try and see, particularly psychologists from Stanford who have tried to see if there's a way to reduce that. And so I actually led, along with a team of fellow graduate students at Vandy, looking at a way, if at a community college, we could run this intervention for the entire community college. Because one of the things about policy research is that often we're trying to do experiments with as many people as possible because we want to try to get as close as we can to generalizing to a state, a country, all sorts of things like that. So I have run experiments on psychological interventions. I've also done interviews and quantitative analysis looking at student collective action or protest movements. In particular, the ones that I've focused on deal with racial equity on college campuses. So looking into that, I'm also currently working on a project that looks at whether or not these service areas for community colleges, so where people are sort of zoned, if we think about K-12 schools to go for community colleges, to look and see whether or not those boundaries are gerrymandered and whether or not that's related to racial segregation at who enrolls in those institutions. So you can sort of see that there are a lot of different ways that the campus experience can be shaped by larger institutional policies or state policies, things like that. And so I like to dive into all of those different pieces. If we go to the next slide, when we think about student financial aid, I primarily study student loans. And in general, what I try to study is the intersections between race, racism, and student loans. So this means that I look at things like who is repaying loans? How difficult is it for them to repay loans? What is difficult about that? What about our society and the structures therein have we set up to make it more difficult for some folks versus others to be able to repay their student loans? I look at things around state policies and debt burden. So as an example, the state of Texas has rules, has goals around how much debt students can take out as undergraduate students. And so I've explored, well, what do we know about students and their experiences that make them more or less likely to have a larger amount of debt? especially debt sort of in ratio to how much they earn. Because you can imagine if you have a lot of debt, but you also earn a lot, maybe we're not as concerned. So I explore all those different pieces, especially looking at race and racism. And then for the next piece, I also look at admissions policies. I am a former assistant dean of admissions at the University of Virginia. And one of the things I really like to do is bring my prior practical experience working in colleges and universities into my research work, because I think it really helps to deepen my knowledge and understanding of how to go about doing research. And so with admissions policies, I've looked at things like states that ban affirmative action, or race conscious admissions policies, and look to see what politically was happening in states around the time that they chose to ban the ability for admissions professionals to use race. And this is especially important because we have a lot of research that shows once you ban the ability to use race in making decisions, that the enrollment of Black and Brown students drops precipitously. And this is true at undergrad levels, graduate student levels, all sorts of things. So trying to better understand politically what's happening before those bans are adopted is incredibly important. I'm also currently actually doing work looking at lotteries for college admission. So a lot of people say there's all this sort of rot in college admissions, and especially when thinking about like Operation Varsity Blues, which is the coolest that college admissions will ever be when we get our own DOJ name for terrible, terrible crimes. And so these all are sorts of things where people say, well, maybe if we just have a lottery, then we could solve all these issues. And so I explore along with a colleague to show that actually getting a lottery doesn't necessarily fix all of the problems that we are concerned with. And then sort of the final example I have is that I've been doing work with a colleague looking at hate crimes and looking at incidences of hate crimes, especially looking at overall hate crimes that are based on race, and then hate crimes that are anti-Black, and then looking at how that relates to Black students' enrollment in colleges and universities, especially when thinking about whether they choose to enroll at an historically Black college or university or a different type of institution. And so really, when you take all of my work together, it comes back to the fact that I'm really interested in how we create structures, how we think about policies in institutions in the states, in our entire country, and how those can either reduce or replicate inequity for students. I think that was my time. Solid.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Baker. Really appreciate it. That was great. So now we have time for one or two questions from the audience.
And there is one question for Dr. Baker. Have you observed any differences in how education policy affects minoritized student success between predominantly white institutional contexts versus minority serving institutions like historically Black colleges and universities?
Yes, excellent question. So yes, is the short answer to this. Definitely there are like books that are written on this, so I will not do this justice. But what I will say is we could talk about like that last project that I just mentioned, which one of the things that we find that's really interesting is that as hate crimes increase in a state, so we can think sort of as racial strife is increasing in a state, we see that Black students are more likely to enroll at HBCUs versus non-HBCUs. And we think that this happens for several reasons, but that one of them is that Black students are able to feel safer, and I mean that from a mental and a physical perspective, by enrolling at HBCUs versus non-HBCUs, which ties into the fact like an HBCU is an institution that was founded before 1965, with the explicit purpose of sort of educating and benefiting the Black community. And so that's just one way that we found several different pieces around HBCUs. In fact, my dissertation focuses in part on HBCUs and student loans. So yes, I think there's a ton of things there.
Any additional questions for Dr. Baker?
There is one more question. What methodologies or theories do you typically use in your research?
Great question. So I am broadly speaking a quantitative researcher. And so that means that that's where my bailiwick sort of is. That doesn't mean tons of people do qualitative work with education policy. I think we need all of it combined to tell a really good holistic story. But the primary work that I do focuses from statistics, psychometrics, and econometrics. So really, I'm often trying to think about either, can I tell a causal story? Can I say that X caused something to happen for students? Or I try to say, what can I sort of deeply describe about this? So the hate crimes is a perfect example. In that paper, we're not able to talk and say that hate crimes causes something to happen, but we do a lot of work with over 20 years worth of data to try to describe what we see happening across the United States when this occurs. When I think about theories that I use, I primarily probably bring in a lot of sociology and political science. So you've heard me talk a lot about sort of larger situations, larger society, how we create institutions, and then how we work within those, which is a very sociological sort of framing. But I also bring in economics when necessary. I'll say that the ed policy program at Peabody is, right, you have some ed policy programs that make you sort of focus on a single discipline area, and that's not really the case at Peabody. LPO is sort of broader than that. And so because of that, I sort of dabble in a lot of different areas. I try to say, what is the question? And what is that? What do I think makes the most sense for that question? And that's how I work with my theories.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Dr. Baker. That was excellent. We really appreciate your time.
Not a problem.
Our next presenter is a graduate of the Psychology and Human Development Department, and that is Dr. Janet Yarboy.
Hello, thanks for having me this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back and to see some familiar names and faces. So as mentioned, my name is Janet Yarboy. I am a pediatric psychologist at a medical center in Chicago. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means to be a pediatric psychologist. Next slide. So I thought I would highlight my background just a bit, since I do have a probably slightly different trajectory than some of my co-presenters today. So I'm a fairly recent graduate from Peabody, as mentioned, in the Department of Psychology and Human Development. Got my PhD in clinical psychology. And then for those of you who are on the clinical science track or maybe applying for that track, usually graduates will complete a one-year clinical internship. And then many will go on to also complete a clinical and or research postdoctoral fellowship to further strengthen some of those skills, and may opt to get licensed around that time as well. And then after postdoc, pretty recently, actually, I accepted a full-time faculty position in an academic medical center, where I do work primarily as a clinician, but I do have some additional responsibilities in research and in supervision of psychology trainees. Next slide. So as I mentioned, my clinical and research interests have largely fallen in this area of clinical psychology, known specifically as pediatric psychology. And broadly, this area deals with issues related to physical health, illness, and psychological development in children and their families. And I wanted to highlight here with these definitions from the Handbook of Pediatric Psychology that many professionals in this field consider themselves to be scientist practitioners. So, believing really strongly that clinical practice is shaped by empirical research and vice versa. So although my current day-to-day, professional day-to-day only involves kind of a sliver of research, science still very much guides, every aspect of the work that I do, including how I assess new patients, how I conceptualize their cases, and ultimately how I move forward with treating their mental illness. Next slide. So in my particular case, my clinical practice has been shaped largely by my work with children and families living with sickle cell disease. And sickle cell is a really complex disorder, but I'll kind of summarize by saying that it's a genetic blood disorder that essentially affects the shape and function of red blood cells, as is loosely illustrated here. And it results in recurrent pain episodes as kind of the primary symptom, but also increased risk of stroke and other complications that can lead to decreased life expectancy for those living with the disease. And from a medical perspective and a psychological perspective, and even more recently from a public health perspective, Sickle cell disease is, really fascinating to study for a number of reasons, but perhaps the most well-known and kind of the most unique characteristic of sickle cell is that it disproportionately affects those of African descent, which I tried to demonstrate with this map that shows the distribution of the alleles responsible for sickle cell disease. Next slide. So during my time at Vanderbilt, I had the great fortune of working with my research advisor, Bruce Compass, who I think might be on the call, and hopefully is okay with me using his picture today, as well as our physician scientist colleague, Dr. Michael DeBon, to explore the role of parents, and more specifically, parenting behavior on functioning in kids with sickle cell disease. And at this time that we started working on this, research around cognitive and psychological outcomes for these kids was largely focused on the physiological processes of the disease. So, increased risk of stroke, like I discussed, and how that affects outcomes. But less on environmental and psychosocial processes, which we saw to be a pretty big gap in the research, particularly given that this is a population that's affected not only by the challenges of living with a chronic health condition, as we know, but also, the challenges of living as a Black person or a Black family in America, and all of the inequalities and inequities that this population faces. Next slide. So using a fairly involved protocol, we invited kids with sickle cell disease and their caregivers into the lab and asked them to complete a battery of questionnaires and a brief cognitive assessment, as well as observed them engaging in a task together, which we later coded for parent behaviors. And over a couple of iterations of this project, we found a few things. We found, of course, that parents are experiencing a great deal of stress in this population, both related to caring for a child with a chronic health condition, but also related to sociodemographic disadvantage that they experience, including issues around financial strain, issues around being single parent with multiple caretaking responsibilities. We also learned that higher levels of reported parent stress were associated with lower levels of responsive parenting, which was characterized by these areas in the middle bullet. And this was particularly in regard to problem solving and collaborating with their child on a cognitively demanding task. And of course, this was completed in the lab, so there's some limitations, but we can easily see how this might transfer to other day-to-day tasks in these families' lives and in managing a chronic illness. We also saw that some of these parenting behaviors predicted child performance on standardized measures of thinking and learning. So for example, working memory and reading achievement. And this is all keeping in mind that this is a population whose medical illness already increases their vulnerability for cognitive problems. So this was a big concern to us. Next slide. So, this explorative work tells us a lot about some potential opportunities for intervention, both directly for youth with sickle cell disease, but also for their caregivers who might benefit from some increased support. So this could look like parent stress management and parent training, both of which are studied in other populations with promising outcomes and are largely considered evidence-based. And I should add that the scope of pediatric psychology is not just about what happens in the doctor's office or about what happens in the therapist's office, but also about advocating for policy and legislation that addresses some of the core issues that we see with regard to socioeconomic and health disparities. So in terms of clinical practice, this work also highlights the importance of considering not just the biological, but also the psychological and psychosocial. So you might be familiar with the biopsychosocial model, and that includes family systems. So it's really important to consider all aspects in the work that we do. Next slide. So tying it all together and kind of making sense of the work that I do, I think that there's lots of opportunities for us to advance and apply clinical science in an academic medicine setting. So even for someone like me who is primarily a clinician, there's still lots of ways to incorporate scholarly work into day to day. So this might look like clinical research, which is kind of the bread and butter, but it might also look like quality improvement, which uses data to improve health delivery. So for example, right now I'm partnering with a hematologist at my hospital to improve the process of addressing patient mental health needs in her growing sickle cell clinic. So she's fairly new to Rush as well and wants to learn more about what her patients are dealing with regard to their mental health and how to better incorporate that into their care. So that can be, research further using quality improvement processes. It might also look like program development or the process of expanding clinical services in a hospital. So for example, I'm currently piloting, using what I learned from my work with sickle cell disease to pilot a new support service for parents of critically ill infants who are admitted to the NICU with the hopes of improving outcomes, not just for parents, but also for their newborn babies with regard to their early attachment and their early development. So lots of ways in which the work that we do in our research can be applied to our clinical work. I think that's it. Any questions?
Fascinating. Thank you, Dr. Yarboy. Let's go ahead and see what questions there might be for you from the audience. And remember to go ahead and add those on the chat box. That would be great.
Yes, Dr. Yarboy, your first question is about responsive parenting behaviors. The question is, do you see responsive parenting behaviors also applicable to very young children like infants and toddlers with sickle cell disease, or even children suffering with other types of chronic illnesses?
Yeah, absolutely. So responsive parenting is something that can be measured for all parents in kind of all contexts. In fact, so the work that we did was primarily with school age kids because we were interested in learning more about their cognitive development. So we were looking at slightly older kids, but a lot of work regarding parenting, particularly responsive parenting, is focused on kind of early childhood and even infancy, which actually ties really nicely into some of the things I'm doing now with parents in the NICU, where you see that responsive parenting, kind of attending to your child's, cues that they might need support or that they might need, nurturing or care, and how that leads to early childhood development. So definitely something that applies with younger children and certainly can be studied across all pediatric populations.
Great, thank you. There's one more question for you. How do you help single parents participate effectively in stress management and skills training when they already have so many things on their plate?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been an ongoing challenge, although we are seeing some opportunities to catch these parents now that there are, increased access to telehealth and ways for parents to be more involved in treatments without having to necessarily come into an office or come into, another facility. What I've seen work well kind of in practice is offering parents opportunities to have their child either in therapy concurrently, or perhaps like some institutions will offer support groups or parent groups where they'll have someone available to kind of work with children while parents work separately. But it is really hard. And I think there's lots more research that needs to be done to figure out how to best, meet these parents where they're at. And like I said, and I didn't want to gloss over this, so much of this really comes down to, how can we support, parents, not just from, a clinical standpoint, but also in terms of, policy, much like, Dr. Baker described earlier, making sure that they're supported in other ways too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yarboy. That was really fascinating and interesting. We really appreciate you taking the time to present here.
Thank you.
We're going to go to our next presenter today, and that is Dr. Samuel David, who is an assistant professor of second language acquisition. He'll introduce himself momentarily and is also a graduate of the, in this case, in the Department of Teaching and Learning here at Peabody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mancilla Martinez and Minho and the folks who have put this together. This has been fascinating for me so far, and I'm grateful to be able to share some of my work. I attended Vanderbilt from 2010 to 2016, and in the program on language literacy and culture. So my training was focused primarily on literacy development for multilingual kids, both in identified for English learner services as well as multilingual kids more broadly. My background prior to that was as a bilingual special education teacher in the elementary and middle school grades in New York. And now I am in Minnesota. So lots of different interesting, diverse, linguistically diverse populations that I've been able to work with. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight a project that I got involved with when I first came to Vanderbilt, working with Dr. Robert Jimenez on Project Translate, which was, the intention of this was to design an intervention to help multilingual students leverage all of their language knowledge to become better readers. There's a lot of, there's research that shows that students who are successful bilingual readers know how to access their bilingualism and to transfer things from one linguistic code to another as they're trying to problem solve during their reading. And some of the unsuccessful students don't do that. They, like much of our society and our policy, think of school as an English-only space where they can't, they shouldn't be thinking in Spanish or thinking about cognates or thinking, using these kinds of strategies. So we wanted to give a tool for teachers to be able, or create a tool to be able to strategically leverage their multilingualism. And so I was fortunate enough in 2010 to walk in as they were just starting data collection, and I got to walk into classrooms and work with kids on this work, and I have continued to be involved. I'm still working with Dr. Jimenez and others. We now have a Spencer grant and are working in a couple of different states. We've gone from creating and tinkering to hopefully doing some mixed methods efficacy work. Although outside of the mixed methods, unlike some of the previous speakers, I am a qualitative researcher and working, in professional development settings with teachers and in classrooms with kids as much as I can. This work for me has branched out into 3 different areas that I've identified down below. So analysis-wise, we're looking at student learning. What do students learn, or what do they have the opportunity to learn when you have them working multilingually? In this case, Project Translate gets small groups of students who share a language together to read a book in English from their curriculum, and then translate small portions of it back into their first language or heritage language, working together. So what is it that they learn as they're doing this kind of work, and how is it helping them? The other question that I've been asking is, how do teachers learn to do this work? Most teachers don't share the language with their students. They aren't comfortable with students speaking another language other than English in their classrooms. Or if they are comfortable or are bilingual, classrooms these days, at least in the cities where I've worked, it's not just one language other than English that's represented, it's many. So they're not going to know all of them. And then finally, I'm looking sort of more theoretically at what is a collaborative translation practice? What is it that we think we're doing? Next slide, please. The next couple of slides, I'm not going to read them. I just kind of threw up some images and bits of data and citations related to these areas, in case you're curious. So as I said, this example is kind of a nice one of students working through a translation problem and noticing, because they're translating, they notice this idiomatic expression has a deeper meaning, and they are able to make some connections that they probably wouldn't have if they had just been asked to read it in English and move on. Next slide. In terms of teacher learning, I've been thinking a lot about, how does a teacher who is exposed to these translanguaging strategies, which is kind of the broad category this translation activity falls under. But you can give them a set of tools, you can give them a protocol or a curriculum, but every group of students is different. Their language proficiencies are different. The context is different, the policy context, the school culture, the teachers' styles. So there's a if you will, a translation process for teachers to go through to take the written strategy or protocol and make it work for the students in front of them. So I've been theorizing around, what is it they need to do? Thinking in terms of engaging, like how do you make it meaningful to the students in front of you? Coding, which is to say, how do you understand what it is that students are doing? You can hear them, you can listen to them translate, but if you don't speak the language, how do you understand what the nature of the problems is, or the sort of meta-linguistic knowledge that they're revealing? And then how do you connect that? How do you leverage what you learn that your students know and can do towards the standards-based instructional goals that you are accountable for teaching? Next slide. Yeah, and then finally, thinking about what these practices represent, I think helps us think about how to move forward in these spaces, these professional development spaces. I've been thinking about translanguaging as this emergent hybrid practice, because the students are bringing in their familiarity with translation and bilingual interactions of various kinds. The teachers are bringing in their sort of school knowledge. And then curriculum designers and folks like me are coming in and saying, well, try this thing out. But even though I'm trying to design something that's hybrid, ultimately it's all the participants in that classroom who are really creating this new practice together. And so I like to study, like, what is that new practice and how does it come together? Next slide. Finally, going a little deeper, this is real recent work. In thinking about this hybrid practice, I've been looking more specifically at materials as a participant in this as well. Each of these spaces is organized in a particular way with particular materials. Teachers make different choices, and those choices really can have an impact on the way that that knowledge is shared, because this really is about collaboratively sharing knowledge and building together to deepen their understandings of literature and reading processes. And that's it. Thank you much.
Thank you, Dr. David. That was wonderful. Now we're going to go ahead and turn it to see if there are any questions for you. I think there are.
Dr. David, what are some strategies that monolingual English teachers could use to engage and monitor students' translingual activities?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you. I think the first and foremost is creating a space where multilingualism is a norm. I think it's a lot of teachers say, well, I'm gonna try something like tell students that they can talk in any language or they can talk to each other. But then students don't, because they sort of recognize the classroom as an English only space. And so there's some work to be done in terms of normalizing multilingualism, positioning yourself, the teacher, as a learner and the students as experts, and really being curious and asking them and learning about what their language backgrounds are. One particular strategy that we found is good for that is something like a multilingual word wall, which on its face, word walls are a familiar practice. You put up the words that students are using and new words that they're exposed to, or content area words like in science. But to do that in all the languages that are represented in the classroom, and not just as the teacher looking it up on Google Translate and sticking it on the wall, but also involving the students in creating that word wall, because then that becomes a conversation and it becomes an opportunity to learn more about the backgrounds of your students. So many teachers, they're sort of open to this work, but once you get started, they realize that they don't actually know what the languages are that their students speak. So part of it is just opening up that space to get to know the students.
Thank you. There's one more question for you. Are there resources or accessible guidelines for teachers who are interested in implementing translingual practices in their instruction?
Yes, and more all the time. This is a real burgeoning field. The folks at CUNY NYSIB are a lot of this work, at least the recent movement in translanguaging, comes from Ofelia Garcia and her colleagues in New York. And they've published a number of translanguaging guides, which are very robust. And at this point, they've got 6 or 7 of them. So they're starting to target, different subpopulations and different teaching contexts. So if you Google translanguaging guide, CUNY, CUNY, you'll find a bunch of different things. They have a great website. And like I said, there's lots more as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. David. We really appreciate you taking time to share a little bit about the excellent work that you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last, but certainly not least, we have our very own Dr. Hasina Mayudin, and I will let her introduce herself momentarily, but she is a graduate of the Community Research and Action Program here at Peabody.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. My name is Hasina Mayudin. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Peabody College. And I'll be talking a little bit about a digital inclusion needs assessment project that I'm currently working on. Next slide, please. A little bit about me. I did recently just get my PhD from the Community Research and Action Program. And honestly, I didn't originally plan on joining this program. As a Muslim mother and educator, I was teaching at a local Islamic school and looked to Peabody because I was interested in getting a degree in teaching. But as I explored the programs that Peabody has to offer, I found the Community Research and Action Program, and it just really spoke to me and what I was passionate about. I really wanted to think more deeply about what community development looked like for the communities that I was part of, and also how I could support that growth and development through research and practice. And I had wonderful mentors like my advisor, Doug Perkins, who supported me on this journey. And I will also say that this journey has been definitely a winding one that led me to a position in administration here at Peabody, but has also allowed me the opportunity to continue to do research within communities as a research associate. And while I don't have time to talk much about that journey today, I'm absolutely happy to talk about that in the future. So please do reach out if you'd like to chat about that further. Next slide, please. So the study I'd like to talk to you about today is a digital inclusion needs assessment project. And we've known for years that there is a digital divide, but COVID has really highlighted the difference in digital access that is experienced by different communities. And as conversations were happening across Nashville about how to bridge this divide, particularly in K-12 education, Dr. Fallon Wilson of Black in Tech Nashville and Dr. Samantha Perez of the Nashville Chamber of Commerce noticed that many people were having conversations focused on short-term solutions of providing students and families with devices and hotspots, which is really important, but it doesn't really look at the larger ecosystem and systemic issues that needed to be unpacked. And so they founded the Digital Inclusion Task Force, which is a community-led effort supported by Metro Information Technology Services to address digital access and equity here in Nashville. And one of the task force first priorities was to conduct a digital inclusion needs assessment to be able to make data-driven policy recommendations and decisions. There's a history for this. There's a 2017 Connected Nashville report that also called for a needs assessment, and other cities like Austin have conducted digital inclusion surveys. However, the task force really wanted to ensure that such a survey here in Nashville would also capture the experiences and needs of technologically underserved communities, which often tend to be our communities of color and other underrepresented communities, with the goal of really thinking about long-term sustainable solutions for digital inclusion. Next slide, please. So thinking about our research questions, we realized that as we are thinking about long-term solutions, this present moment actually provides an important lens of how people are navigating the digital divide. So in this time of rapid shift into digital environments, we want to better understand how have services and resources shifted during the pandemic, and how has the digital divide affected the ability of individuals and communities to access those services and resources. We also want to know what are the resilient ways in which individuals and communities have adjusted to that shift in services so that we can really highlight and uplift community-based solutions. And ultimately, what we really want to know is how do we best support digital and access and equity across all communities in Nashville. Next slide, please. So this is our study design, and we're kind of in the beginning phases of this. We wanted to start with 50 interviews with nonprofit partners working with diverse communities across Nashville. We've completed about 35 interviews, and we really hope to understand organizational context and also build partnerships with people who are doing the work on the ground, and then move to our second piece, which is a plan to conduct about 20 focus groups with community partners. Again, working with our nonprofit partners to help recruit community members, but really listening to communities that are technologically underserved and understanding what their experiences and needs are. As you can imagine, we definitely want to have a mix of online and in-person data focus groups so that we can collect data for those without digital access. And I think we've mentioned this a couple of times in different talks. It's really important to get feedback from our non-English speaking communities as well to understand those experiences. And we did just get IRB approval for that, so we're going to start working on that piece. And then finally, we would love to do and are working to create a citywide digital inclusion survey. And it's going to be based on the Austin Digital Inclusion Survey, but really refine the questions based on our qualitative data analysis and feedback from our task force and partners to make sure the survey is capturing the experiences and needs of all of our communities and that we're actually asking the right questions. We also hope to oversample our underrepresented communities by partnering with nonprofits to do field work for data collection. And it's really important for us that we're able to make sure we have funding to pay our partners for their time and efforts, and that we ensure that our data is accessible as well for our partners and for the community. Next slide, please. So just based on our interview, a few preliminary findings. Metro Nashville Public Schools' decision to provide devices and hotspots really have impacted many different nonprofits. Several organizations reported that they were able to continue to provide at least some of their services because families did have access to a device and internet. But again, the devices and internet were paid through CARES Act funding. And so there's no long-term plan or funding to continue to support these technological services. And for those who don't have school-age children, very few organizations used funding to get support for devices or internet for the community members that they serve. So really depending on Metro Nashville schools to drive a lot of the increased need for digital access. And as we kind of have all probably experienced at some point or other, even with devices and internet, there's still problems with connectivity across cities, particularly in rural areas, in apartments, with people with many users within their family that all are accessing the internet at the same time. So those are important pieces that we need to kind of think about how to address. And again, the impact of language barriers when you're trying to navigate these systems that you're not used to and are really trying to support families in being able to navigate, particularly in educational spaces. And that brings us to like the one thing that several of our participants have noted is there's a need for ongoing culturally responsible tech support. So not just having a website, not just having a number, but having a physical person there, someone who understands your cultural context, and that it's not just a one-time thing, it's probably something that requires ongoing support. And finally, participants really emphasized the social and emotional impacts on communities and the importance of addressing issues like isolation and anxiety as we talk about digital inclusion. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And now I think Min might have a question or two for you.
Yes, the first question is from Dr. Perkins. He asks, is there attention in your survey to the potential for an intergenerational program in which younger, more tech-savvy members of the community might teach or assist older, less tech-savvy members?
Yes, and thank you for that question, Doug. And that has actually been particularly some of our education nonprofits that do work with youth have been highlighting this piece. And we do have plans to do focus groups with youth to kind of talk about how they are experiencing this issue, like how are they working within their family and to support the family as a whole, because we know and in many families that younger generations are supporting older members of their families to be able to access online resources. And so we definitely want to be able to highlight how that's happening and in what ways we can continue to support youth in finding spaces to take the leadership in those efforts.
Thank you. The second question is, what roles can teachers play to contribute to digital inclusion for their students?
I think this is a great question. I think we have found that actually a lot, because of the ways in which our public school systems have provided digital access through increased through providing devices and internet hotspots, that teachers are have become resources for their students to ask questions to find out how to access tech support. I think just normalizing the types of things that families are going through and the ways in which people can ask questions is a really great way that teachers can be supportive. A lot of teachers during the pandemic, we've heard reports of doing house visits or doing phone calls to lead people through how to do things online. So thinking about different methods of providing support and also highlighting the fact that families and students are resilient and are doing great things. So just like uplifting those stories, I think is really important as well.
Thank you. Well, everyone, believe it or not, for me, it flew by. I hope it did as well for all of you. I think these were 5 excellent, super interesting and varied presentations. And so here you have everyone who spoke their names and emails. If you're interested in following up with any questions or comments, I know they would welcome that. And I include myself in that group. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear them. And again, thank you to each of our 5 presenters. I hope this gave everyone a nice taste of the excellent work that our alumni are doing and that you engage with us more. So have a good rest of your evening and thank you so much for joining us today.